Yeah, thanks everybody for joining for this talk about acceleration, specifically how you can optimize the images on your Drupal website to make your site load faster. And so one question, actually, let's start quickly. As mentioned before, my name is Martin Anderson-Clutz, Drupal.org, Twitter, various social platforms. I go by ManClue. I work at Acquia and certified for Drupal and a few other things as well. So the first question to sort of get out of the way is really, is it important to have your site load quickly? So the short answer is whatever you use as a metric for success for your website, you're going to be able to have your website be more successful if it loads quickly. So there's a variety of different studies that have been done, basically showing if you want to look at, conversion rates, willingness to buy, a variety, bounce rates, basically any metric you look at. If your site takes longer to load, it's going to do a less effective job of, whatever it is that you built your site to do. And so here's a sort of, quick data point in terms of really showing that, very, I think, straightforward relationship. As the site takes longer to load, it has a lower conversion rate. We can also see that this is actually a problem that's been getting worse over time. So if you look at the Web Almanac, you can see that over the last 10 years, it's pretty much a straight line in terms of websites taking, longer and longer to load. And I feel like in the Drupal community, oftentimes when I hear people talking about optimization, they're really talking about, different caching strategies and ways that you can make the Drupal page be rendered faster. But oftentimes when I've audited websites, what I see is actually something that looks a lot like this, where it's really actually the images that are the main culprit. And so I thought it would be good to talk about some of the strategies that we can all use with our Drupal site to make the images as efficient as possible in terms of how they're going to load. Now, that being said, when we dive into this, we're going to talk about a few different strategies, but at the highest level, I hope that you'll take away these sort of like three main buckets in terms of how you can make the loading of your images as efficient as possible. So number one, the most effective strategy is going to be deferring the loading of your images. Second most is really going to be sizing your images properly. And then the last one is really around optimizing. And oftentimes I think people sort of sometimes we'll kind of do it in the reverse order, but the good news is actually, deferring is, in my opinion, the most effective strategy because, if a image doesn't have to load at all, then, that's the most effective strategy at all, right? It's literally zero time. If, it's lazy loading, it's at the bottom of the page and the user doesn't scroll down there, it's not going to require any bandwidth. It's not going to delay the load of the page whatsoever. And ever since Drupal 8.2, lazy loading is built into Drupal by default. There is some control that's built into Drupal, but if you want some additional configuration options, Blazy is a really solid choice as an image. I've used it on quite a few websites. It gives you some extra customization options. It can also lazy load your video player, which can be great because video players can load in some cases like a couple of megabytes of different like JavaScript and other kinds of assets. And so, if you're dealing with a website where for whatever reason you need to have, let's say, a video player on the homepage, then being able to lazy load that is going to make a huge difference for the performance of your website. And I'll just point out here, I'll make these slides available. These are links to the actual modules that you can use if you want to employ some of these strategies on your own website. And there is kind of a convention that I've used here. So if you see a link that's green, that's for a module that is already D10 ready. And if it's bold, that means it has a stable release. So in this case, Blazy is both D10 ready with a stable release. And so, there's really, if you need to do either, the deeper customization or lazy load your video player, there's really no reason not to use the Blazy module there. So the second main strategy that we talked about was really around sizing your images. So I've definitely seen a lot of websites where the images are being, cropped or sized via CSS and then sending down some huge image. And really it slows down the site, just serving up pixels that a user won't even see, which is, is really, it's slowing down their experience. It's potentially costing the site owner money in terms of, bandwidth charges and some of those kinds of things. So as we dig into this, a couple of secondary concepts here. So number one, if you're cropping the image, try and do that with Drupal so that, again, you're not actually sending pixels to a user that they're never going to see. You want to also shrink the image, again, using Drupal as opposed to just with CSS. And then also, we're going to talk a little bit around responsive images and how that can be a really effective strategy to make sure that people on different devices are really getting the appropriately sized images. So first, talking about cropping, and we sort of saw that graphic in the section header there around just making sure that we're actually, cropping the image to just the part that's going to be shown. You can sort of do that arbitrarily with Drupal out of the box, just using core, but the crop API gives you a couple of options to really make sure that you're cropping to sort of the appropriate part of the image. And so there's a couple of modules here. Focal point allows you to basically set which part of the image you consider the most crucial, and then it'll automatically crop around that at whatever size you're rendering. But you may have some site owners that want to have the manual control at sort of every resolution. And so the image widget crop module gives the site editors that kind of manual control. So depending on sort of, whether you think your editors want more sort of ease of use or the manual control, you can sort of pick between those. And again, talking about our convention here, we can see that all of these have stable releases. At this point, none of them have a D10 ready release, but they're quite popular, so it wouldn't surprise me if we see those before long. All right, the next sort of secondary concept here is around sizing. So using image styles to shrink your images. Again, something that is built into Drupal core. I've provided a link here to the user guide. I'm sure there's lots of different kind of tutorials, probably videos, even recordings of like DrupalCon and different camp presentations. But essentially the main idea here is to set up image styles for every kind of proportion and size that you're going to use your images. Don't just use CSS to sort of, resize or crop them. And then the other thing to remember is that there are Retina devices. So particularly on mobile, you may have devices that are viewing images at 2 or 3, or I think even in some cases now 4 times their sort of like official resolution. And so the trade-off there is that typically, if you can, you want to try and provide higher resolution images for the devices that are going to be able to benefit from those, but you don't want to necessarily send those huge images to devices that won't benefit from them. And that's where your site is really going to benefit from using responsive images, which again is something that's built into core. And there's actually a couple of different approaches. So one is using the image source set, which I think in many ways is probably the easiest one to set up, but I feel like a lot of the tutorials that you see online are really using the picture element. So using both of them are really around setting up image styles for sort of the different sizes. With the image source set, you basically tell the browser, or sort of the site, what the proportion is. So if it's 100% of the viewport width, or some proportion, and then you just make those, and then essentially the browser will, based on the size of window, automatically pick which image. Whereas this other method, you have to do a little bit more configuration in terms of sort of setting the breakpoints and then saying which one you want served at the different breakpoints. So this one is a bit more work to set up. You can also do things like art directions. So the idea of using like different proportions at different sizes. And then also the picture element better supports potentially using different sort of like fallback image formats that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. In addition to these tutorials, I also have a link to this module called Easy Responsive Images that is really designed to sort of give you out of the box a set of responsive images that you can use within your website. So potentially that's a time saver. I will confess that I haven't really used this one myself because I'm familiar enough with the process of setting these up manually, but definitely something to check out if it's something you want to try out. Maybe even just install it on a dummy site and sort of see how they set it up, and then potentially sort of, use what you find in what that module provides to sort of devise your own strategy manually. So something there, but again, this being green and bold means that it is both D10 ready and has a stable release. All right, so the third section that we're going to talk about is really around sort of optimizing the images. So once you've got your images, lazy loading, you've got them, cropped and sized, how can you make the actual images themselves as efficient as possible in terms of how they're going to load? So the secondary concepts we're going to talk about here are really around making sure you're using the best format, and then also about doing processing to sort of strip out any unnecessary data. So we could talk about some of the more common formats like JPEG and PNG files, but I feel like particularly as some of the what Google would call next generation formats that we're going to talk about here are getting pretty widespread in terms of the browser support. I would say really try and focus on these, and especially because a number of these are pretty easy to support now in modern versions of Drupal. So the first one that we're going to talk about here is WebP. So I've got sort of the can I use numbers here. So you can see it's almost 97%, so pretty widely supported. You can use it for both continuous tone and line art, so kind of like photographs, as well as like logos and charts types of graphics. It does have support for animations. Drupal core does have support for WebP. The caveat there is that if you use the WebP support that's built into core, it is not going to do like a fallback image in terms of like having, let's say, a JPEG or a PNG as a fallback. So that's where you get the benefit of using a module like the WebP or Image API Optimize WebP. I think these two are fairly equivalent. Both of them will work with Image API Optimize, which is usually what I use in terms of actually, processing and optimizing your images. AVIF is a newer format. It's actually sort of the still image version of the AV1 video format that's sort of growing in popularity. Notionally, it's meant to be have smaller images rendered than WebP, but I've seen some discussion online that that's not necessarily always true. I think it tends to be not quite as good for sort of line art and those kinds of images, so better for photographs. It does have support for like HDR images, so high dynamic range. It can also do animations and some other things. It is a newer format, so it has less browser support. So you can see, 70% instead of 97%. There is this AVIF module. It's really meant for more like responsive images to render those as AVIF. There's a companion AVIF lib, which basically adds a local library for doing the conversion into that format. There's also this Image API Optimize AVIF. This is actually maintained by Sasha Eggenberger, who you may know as the maintainer of the excellent Gin admin theme. This one currently doesn't have any stable release. It actually only has a dev release, but it is Drupal 10 ready. It does depend also on PHP 8.1, as well as having the relevant sort of GD support built into your PHP. So potentially some hurdles there in terms of being able to use it on your website, but definitely an option there. There is also this module called Image API Optimize AVIF and WebP. So one module you can install that will generate both. So AVIF with a WebP fallback, and then a legacy format like a JPEG as a fallback there as well. So kind of powerful. I would say definitely try some of these out and sort of see what works best for the kinds of images that you use on your own website, and test that out with some of the testing tools that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. Format-wise, the last format that we're really going to talk about here is SVG, so Scalable Vector Graphics. Essentially, it defines an image instead of sort of as rows of pixels as vector lines. It's actually like an XML format, so you can actually read the content of the SVG. There are some of these approaches can allow you to even inject that inline. So as opposed to having that as an external file that loads, actually have the XML content within your HTML page. You can see that the support for SVG is extremely widespread at this point, very close to 100%. So definitely something that you can use for lots of applications. And also, unless the image that you're using is very complex, oftentimes an SVG is going to be a tiny fraction of even like a PNG file in terms of the size of that. So extremely efficient. They're also scalable. So it's the same file size, whether you use it like tiny in the header or like giant, full width as some kind of a background element. You can use the same image file either way, and it's perfectly scalable. So it's very flexible. There are potentially some cool things that you can do, and we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. I think the biggest caveat with SVG is that unless you're starting with vector artwork, it can be labor intensive to convert something to SVG. So if you're starting with like an Illustrator file, some PDFs or APS files can be converted to SVG easily. But that may be something, if you're working with a designer, that you want to make sure that you get the right graphic to start to get that converted to SVG. From an Drupal module support standpoint, there are 3 different modules you can use. So there's SVG image and SVG image field, which are pretty similar. SVG formatter is basically a formatter that you can use on sort of a standard file field within Drupal. So a little bit different in terms of how that one works, but you can see these are all pretty popular and have stable releases as well. In terms of actually optimizing the images, then you want to use this image optimize API as a way to, again, sort of strip out any additional like header information. Sometimes there may be like copyright or other information that these things can help to sort of strip out, again, the spirit of being just to make these as small as possible. So there are sort of companion modules that you can use. So image optimize local binaries is one that you can use if you have some of these utilities installed locally on your server or have the ability to install those locally. There is a blog that is linked here that somebody has actually gone through. I'll actually click through it pretty quickly to show, because it's pretty interesting what they've done. They actually took an image and ran it through a variety of different utilities here, and they've kind of summarized the results. You can see that, as an example, with the PNG, most of these were pretty close. This PNG quant is substantially higher in terms of the savings, but this one is actually using kind of a lossy format. So it's actually losing information. There's potentially, depending on how aggressive you set this, some visual degradation. So, whether you want to go that far is maybe something that you want to test out with the kinds of images that you're going to use on your own website, and sort of decide if being that aggressive is worth the trade-off of the potential for visual degradation. But obviously the other option, particularly with PNGs, is if you can serve that with something like an SVG instead, you may be able to get even smaller without any kind of sort of visual degradation. But I thought that was a pretty interesting read to sort of understand some of the capabilities there. Let me just skip back. There are also, if you can't have sort of the local binaries, there are other services that you can use to potentially optimize your images. So Resmush It has sort of like a free tier, and then once you use it, beyond a certain amount, then they sort of ask you to start paying for it. And then there's also another image processing service called Kraken that you can pay for. I think, to me, the biggest drawback of using these remote services, they're easy to set up. But if you, as an editor, go to upload an image, you will, at least in my experience, see sort of an actual, there's a noticeable delay between when you save your article, as an example, and when you see the actual, like a header image load, as an example. So sometimes editors can find that a bit disconcerting, but the trade-off being it's simple setup, potentially free. So maybe it's a thing that you can sort of address with documentation and training as an example. So some options there. A couple of other things that I'll mention here, just sort of additional strategies. The htaccess file. So if you're on a site that is using Apache as your web host, there's these htaccess files where you can do kind of some additional server configuration. You can use that to set the cache lifetime for your images. You can also set your SVGs, potentially your fonts and other files to serve up being compressed. And those are things that can help as well. You can also look at ImageMagick as an alternative to sort of the GD library that runs as part of PHP. The benefit there is that it's not sort of like competing for PHP resources. So some folks figure that that makes for, faster processing of your images as well. So some things that, depending on what access you have, what server environment you're working with, are potentially things to try, but your mileage may vary. And with a lot of these things, really, test it out, see what actually works best for your site individually. In terms of actually testing your website to sort of see what's working and what isn't, these are some tools that you can use. So webpagetest.org is one that I like to use quite a bit. I find that it gives, very detailed reporting. PageSpeed Insights. I think the biggest benefit for this is that you're basically getting feedback from Google. And, because one of the big benefits of performance optimization is really, better SEO, then there's no higher authority for SEO, I would say, than Google. So getting it from them in terms of what they consider to be the areas where you can optimize your site, I think is invaluable. Also, the other thing is if it's a site that you're still working on locally and can't sort of, test with some of these online tools, then Lighthouse is going to give you very similar feedback to PageSpeed Insights, but you can run it against sort of local websites because it's a, part of your Chrome browser. The other tool that I've seen recently, I haven't used it a ton myself, is this Expert PageSpeed. It's actually a crawler, which is kind of cool. So you point it at your website and it'll actually crawl all of the pages and then give you sort of, detailed reporting of all of the different pages. I would say if you're going to be pointing this at your production website, definitely make sure that your web team is aware of that, because having a crawler go out and suddenly ingest all of the pages on your website, I've seen that sort of create some grief for websites. So, I would say use that one with caution, particularly for a site that is in production. If money is no object, there are definitely some ways that you can kind of offload the effort of making your images load as quickly as possible. So you could use a CDN. A couple of examples here, Cloudflare and Akamai, both can do sort of that automatic image processing, and essentially, you just host your site through their CDN, and they have services that can sort of do a lot of this optimization automatically, even taking into account the user agent, whether it's a mobile device or a tablet or those other kinds of things, and sort of appropriately adjusting or optimizing the images based on those. There's a CDN module if you don't want to put your whole site behind and just have it load kind of the assets, the images, JavaScript, and so on. There is also this module for OptiPick, which is sort of, again, a service that you can use to automatically optimize all of your images. And this TwicPix is a newer service. It's one that I believe is hosted out of France. Has some interesting options in terms of being able to automatically crop using sort of, AI to identify the key parts of the image. But right now, the Drupal integration part of this one is a bit of a work in progress. So not for the faint of heart, but an interesting one to sort of keep an eye on over time here. So I've got some resources here in terms of additional reading. I would say this talk is largely based on this blog post that was written a couple of weeks ago. There's also a companion tutorial, so sort of a step-by-step in terms of how to set up some of these things that we've talked about. And then there's also some additional reading. Here, this one is a comparison of AVIF and WebP and actually has some examples, which is pretty useful. And this one has some interesting techniques that you can use with SVG images if you're going to be using those on your site. So just as a wrap up then, coming back to sort of, the high level concept in terms of the strategies to use. Again, I think to the extent that you can defer the loading of images, there's nothing more effective than, having an image not have to load at all. From sizing, make sure that you can crop, shrink, and make your images responsible as much as possible. And then in terms of optimizing your images, make sure you're using the best format possible and also processing them as much as possible as well. So that is the talk that I have prepared, and happy at this point to open it up for questions. Okay, so looking in the chat here, let's go back here. If anybody wants to come off mute while I'm just going back through the history here, feel free as I go back here. So haven't found a module that integrate well with media. Is there a new media crop somewhere? So I've definitely used the focal point with media library. I believe the crop one, image crop, will work with media library as well. But I think there's like a preview link, and then you open it up, and then it gives you sort of all of the different widgets there to crop for your various image styles. So I've seen that work, but your mileage may vary. There's probably assistance that you can get with the individual modules as well. Bob, lots of great links here. Are you sharing those later as well? Yes, I will definitely make these slides available online afterwards so that you'll be able to access those slides. And Amy June, I don't know if there's a way we can make that available through SFDUG, but I can probably also post it to Twitter or something like that as well.
Yeah, we can put it on the event page, and then when we broadcast the video, we can do that too, but we'll do that before we do the video. So yeah, if you just put the link, we'll share it out.
Okay, awesome. Okay, Ralph has a comment here. In regards to AVIF, Jake Archibald did a great write-up introducing AVIF back in 2020, and it contains comparisons between image formats, including visual examples. So link in there. Thanks for that. That looks like a great resource. Interesting, no mention of GIF, long out of patent. Often GIF is much smaller than PNG. Don't know how it compares with WebP. So I believe that WebP is supposed to be smaller than GIF, but I feel like oftentimes with a lot of these, it's worth testing out. You may find that for some particular kinds of images, maybe GIF is still better than even WebP. So definitely, I think it's worth sort of testing out with the sites that your images actually uses. One other thing that I'll mention about formats that I've seen a few times is where there may also be an element of training in terms of how making sure that editors choose the best format before they upload. Now, if you're converting over to like, WebP or some of these other formats that are pretty flexible in terms of working with different kinds of images, it's maybe not as crucial. But I've definitely seen sites where an editor had this, large stock photography image, but they downloaded like a PNG. And then when they uploaded that to Drupal, even though it's like resizing and cropping and doing some other things, it's still a really massive file because like PNG is just not a good, efficient format for that kind of image. And as I say, if Drupal isn't actually converting between formats, then that's still going to be a really big problem. So sometimes also, editor education can be a crucial element there. So Saban says GT metrics is equally effective as Google PageSpeed Insight. So great tip there. Haven't used that tool myself, but always good to have more options. PNG offers wider color palettes than GIF, 8-bit versus 32, also has better sort of transparency. So GIF is sort of like binary transparency, which means you can sort of get like fringing or halos for the transparency. Whereas you can get smoother transparency with your PNG, but the trade-off there is typically a bit larger file size for the, particularly if you're using the transparency there. Martin, should we switch from GD Image Toolkit to Image Magic? I would say, everything that I've read is that ImageMagick is best practice, but to me the big trade-off is that you have to have ImageMagick installed at the server level. It's not something that you can just sort of like include in your Drupal site and then use it. So it's sort of like there's a bit of a higher kind of barrier to entry in terms of getting it installed in your environment. So I would say if you can use it, I would recommend it. But as with a lot of things, I would say test it out with your individual scenario. Sometimes you may find that if you're doing things like wanting to use, let's say, WebP or AVIF conversion, you may find that it's easier to do that with, the GD approach than ImageMagick, or vice versa, again, depending on, the versions of software that you're using. So with a lot of these things, it's really sort of like understand what's sort of, I would say commonly understood as best practices, but really as much as you can test everything with your site and the images that you want to use, and see what works best for your individual scenario. Okay, we've got, Amy-June's posted the link to the blog there. Fire hopes. Hopefully it wasn't too rushed as I tried to get through this in the 20 minutes that I know I'm going to be allotted at DrupalCon. With respect to animated format, is there any animation detection? Looped or long animations present WCAG issues. Yeah, that's a good call. And I think one of the advantages of if you can animate with something like an SVG is you probably have more control over that in terms of like, using CSS to sort of, stop or control based on how people might have their browser configured in terms of like, reduced animation and some of those kinds of things. So, or what is it? Reduced motion. So yeah, I think the animation is definitely a good call out in terms of really being sensitive that while animation in some instances can sort of, add a layer of context or engagement, that it definitely can present an accessibility issue. Let's see, what if any services offer compression options for all file types we discussed, WebP and AVIF? So I definitely know that, actually, if I just go back here in my slides, let's go back. If you go back to here, so I think any of these will convert to WebP. I think some of these will do AVIF. I'm not sure off the top of my head with fallback. So, there's definitely options out there in terms of being able to do these conversions automatically. But I would say you probably want to look at these. There's probably also trade-offs in terms of cost for some of these too, right? So like I know Cloudflare has a free plan. I use it on my own blog, but if you want the actual sort of like image optimization part, then you're definitely have to be up into a paid tier before you're going to be able to use their service for that. So yeah, let's see. Tim says, is WebP a common enough format yet that I can ask clients to convert images to WebP and upload instead of JPEG? So my suggestion would really be, if you can, to get Drupal to do conversion between formats, so that from like an editor standpoint, you basically say, get the image from Unsplash or from your photographer or wherever they're getting the images, and then have the site do the work of making sure that it's converted into an appropriate format, it's sized, and all of those other good things, so that because you can teach an editor to save things in a specific way so that they'll be highly optimized, but they may forget over time. They may get switched into a different role, and then the person who gets hired to replace them doesn't get trained properly, and then 6 months down the road, everybody's asking why the site takes 2 minutes to load every page, kind of thing. So the more you can not rely on sort of manual intervention for those kinds of optimizations, I feel like you're going to be better set up for success in the long term. We use Resmush on our primary site and optimize as well, but only supports PNG, JPEG, and GIF. So okay, that's a good call. Appreciate that, Eric. I haven't used Resmush it myself a lot, mostly because of the sort of, noticeable lag, and because a lot of the sites that I've worked on, I've had either the ability to install those local binaries, or some of the hosting, like popular Drupal hosting environments, will allow you to use those basically pre-installed. So, knowing what your options are in terms of where your site is hosted is also obviously an important part of this as well. Besides cost, are there other downsides or trade-offs to relying on Cloudflare for handling images? I mean, to me, cost is definitely the big one. I feel like there's potentially a bit of like, you might say, like a portability issue. So if you can set up your website so that wherever you host it, and without relying on CDN, it's going to do a good job of optimizing your images, then I feel like you just have more options available. Whereas if you're relying on Cloudflare, then the minute you don't have the budget for it, then you sort of feel stuck, and you've got to scramble to get that in place. So I would say if you can figure out how to set things up to have Drupal kind of do the heavy lifting, then I think you're better off. But obviously, there are trade-offs of cost versus manpower, expertise, some of those other things. Excuse me. Ralph has a comment here in regards to performance testing. You also have to keep in mind that PageSpeed Insights as well as Lighthouse utilize Crux, so more or less lab data. Web page tests instead is assessing the report from a certain location on a certain device or computer, and also has the option to use Lighthouse based on these performance as well. Therefore, I would always use web page tests. I mean, I tend to prefer web page tests, but to me, I understand what you're saying about, Crux and how it's more of a simulation as opposed to sort of, testing on a real device. At the end of the day, though, when you think about the, particularly sort of the SEO consideration of optimization, understanding how Google thinks of your website in terms of whether or not it's fast, I think is important. And the more that you can follow what it suggests in terms of guidelines around, like image formats or cache headers and some of those other things, I feel like you're just setting yourself up for success. So usually I'll try and use a combination of those. Opensource.com has an article recently on resizing. Okay, thanks for that, Amy June. Tim Erickson, Amy June, getting access denied for that test article. Okay, we've got some links. Maybe what I'll try and do is, before we move on, try and copy all of these comments so that I'll try and get some of these additional links that people have provided in the chat into the presentation, and those will be in kind of the notes that get posted later on. So
I'll grab those for you, Martin.
Okay, thanks. Let's see here. And Ralph says, also to note is the responsive image linter. GitHub, let's see, responsive image is very useful. So, all right, well, thanks for that, Ralph. Any other sort of questions, comments, anything people want sort of clarified? Anything, suggestions in terms of how this could have been better, more informative, more exciting? Looks like we're good. All right.
Just a thought, Martin, but and I don't know if you've got time between now and then, but a post on best practices maybe across the board would be great.
Okay, so when you're talking about best practices, are you meaning like how to set specifically configure things, or?
No, like in maybe any kind of design guidance or design preparation information for images, and not necessarily the things on the site, but the things for editors as they go into this.
Okay.
Or like a design guide or style guide. A lot of style guides will have information as far as how they like to do photos, for instance, or images.
Okay.
Might be a reach time-wise, but yeah.
All right.
Oh, for a suggestion to make it a little more dynamic, I mean, obviously you can put in some image examples
Okay.
using these different services and modules.
Okay. All right. Appreciate that. Any other thoughts?
I have a kind of tangential question that you may not have the answer for, Martin.
Okay.
When we lazy load our images, how does that affect like our accessibility? You know what I mean? Like, if you have a screen reader doing like a rotor where they're going through all of the images, looking at the alt text, how does lazy loading affect that? Do you have any idea?
I'm inclined to say that it shouldn't affect it in terms specifically for screen readers, because it should still have the basically the placeholder on the page.
Okay.
It's really just the file that doesn't load until the the viewport goes down to a certain page. So
Okay, so JavaScript, it doesn't matter. You don't have to like have a no script tag or anything like that.
well, so the benefit in particular to the lazy loading, as an example, that's built into Drupal, is that it's really using like an attribute on images as opposed to something that's like JavaScript based.
Okay.
So at that stage, it's really more leveraging a capability that Google has built into Chrome, and now other browsers are starting to support, specifically to provide a better experience for users, but without having to rely on, JavaScript and sort of, like hacky workarounds that, to your point, might have, accessibility implications.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I guess I have a question on, and this is more of a CSS thing about container awareness.
Okay.
Sometimes you'll have like a paragraph tile setup, and it could go into a full width section, or it could go into a half or a third, and it may have an image attached to it. And so optimizing for that kind of situation where it's not really a screen width thing.
Yes, I would say, I mean, to the extent that how it's, changing between some of those layouts might be based on breakpoints, you can set the breakpoints, particularly if you're using, let's switch back to here when we talk about the responsive images. So particularly with this source set, so you can say like, up until this breakpoint, it's, whatever, 50% of the viewport width, but then beyond that, it's 100%. As an example, right? And so the nice thing there is that you basically just say, here's how to figure it out. And then you just basically tell the browser like, and here's a bunch of images of different sizes. And then it's up to the browser to basically figure out which image that it needs to load. With some of the, I know what you're talking about in terms of, some of the more modern CSS techniques in terms of like, container queries and some other things might be less straightforward in terms of being able to size those. That's a great question, and off the top of my head, I'm not exactly sure how you would solve for those, but I have to think that there's probably, if you go into like CSS tricks or Smashing Mag, probably other people who have been working on solutions for those kinds of scenarios. So excellent question, and hopefully there are smarter people than me who have been working on this.
Up with just stock image styles even.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like as long as you're trying to provide some way of sort of offering at least different sizes, so that it's not like, well, sometimes this paragraph is full width, and sometimes it's like in a 3-column presentation. So, but we don't know which is which. So we're just always going to serve it to be like, 2,000 pixels wide. Like that's to me is like the worst case where basically I've seen site builders more or less go like, well, the client just wants it to look good and they don't care. And so we're basically just going to make it huge. And there's like potentially 10 of these on the page. And then people are like, well, why does that page take 3 minutes to load? And it's like, well, that's exactly why. So even trying to do some simple things to kind of mitigate that, I feel like is better, even if it doesn't, there may be some specific, like, if they're like tablet and horizontal for whatever reason, like is maybe not always 100% optimal, but it's like a tiny percentage of users that are seeing that. Like, I feel like potentially there are trade-offs that may be acceptable, and maybe that's a conversation that you want to have with your customer to say, like, there are potentially some edge cases where people are maybe not getting the best possible experience, but the trade-off is that, on mobile devices and desktop that we know are like 85%, people are getting like a much better experience. So, I would say making an effort to do something is better than sort of, just sort of throwing your hands up and saying, we're just going to inject giant images instead. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I feel like at least using some image styles to have some options in there is definitely better than nothing. All right. If there aren't any other sort of questions or comments around the image sizes, I did also have some extra content that I could talk about around the event platform. That's a new thing in the Drupal community, and some of the interesting sort of capabilities that are evolving around that in terms of being able to manage dates and times. So maybe a good thing to do here would be to just go and look at the event platform for anybody who's not familiar with it.
Do you want me to stop the recording, or do you want me to just morph it all together?
I mean, I feel like that's kind of up to you. Like I don't see any big downside to having it recorded if you want, but if you'd rather stop the recording here and have that as its own piece, then.
I just wanted to know if you didn't mind having it recorded, because I can just put it in the description on YouTube that you have some bonus material. So, okay.
Okay, great. So event platform is something that started being worked on, I want to say about a year ago. There used to be something called I think it was Camp Organizers Distribution, COD as people in the community called it. Basically meant to be sort of a time saver for people who wanted to create a website for hosting, something like a bad camp or mid camp. Some kind of a Drupal-based event for managing sessions and sponsors and all those good things. So in Drupal 7, it was something that it sounds like it was relatively well used. It sounds like at least my impression is a little bit on the difficult to maintain side. Kind of never really got ported over to Drupal 8, and so there was a discussion within the community of like, how do we have some kind of equivalent solutions so that as these camps either are making new websites for like their, 2022 camps, or even, for people who want to start a camp, how can we sort of, lower the barrier to entry there in terms of making that easier? And so one of the things that we wanted to do is sort of, instead of making that a distribution, which distributions are known to be sort of more challenging to maintain from a maintainer standpoint for the distribution itself, but then also for the site maintainer can have some challenges around like not being able to update, as an example, Drupal core when there's a security update, because you have to wait for that to be in a new release of the distribution. And then, that may have a bunch of complex dependencies for certain modules and different things that way. And so tried to get away from that distribution model. And event platform essentially under the hood has a variety of different modules. So if we see here, there's ones around managing sessions, sponsors, job listings, featured speakers, and sort of, different sort of more granular capabilities, so that if there were only some of these capabilities that you wanted to use in a camp website, you can kind of be more selective around which ones you want to install. Or you can sort of go through, as an example, if you wanted to do the simplest possible install, you install this event platform Olivero, and it'll install the rest of the modules as well as place blocks in the right spots. And that's kind of what we're going to see tonight in this demo that I'm going to show in terms of being able to show some of these capabilities here. So there was also this blog, I think it was in the weekly drop this week. So if you haven't seen that, you can go in. Let's go back in here. It does have some examples of some of the UI that we're going to see. But I thought, since I knew we were going to have some extra time tonight, we could actually get a little bit hands-on, look at some of these capabilities. And if people have, questions or want to understand, that's great for event platform, but how could I use some of these capabilities in some other website where I want to manage dates and times? We can definitely have some of those conversations as well. So some of the new capabilities that we're going to talk about, really around being able to have a dynamically generated session schedule. So actually, let's just skip ahead here. So the event platform essentially is based on the excellent work that was done on the Florida Drupal Camp website for the 2022 version, and really trying to sort of, in some ways, generalize it and make it reusable so that other camps can use it as the basis for their own websites. And this is sort of the session schedule on that website. It actually uses menu tabs as the way to navigate between these are sort of like manually created displays. It's I would say, very elegant way of creating that, but it does require sort of manual work in terms of specifying exactly which date to use for each of the displays, making sure that they're configured to navigate between them in a very specific way so that it kind of creates these properly. So I would say for an experienced Drupal user, not a big deal, but part of the goal of this whole event platform is really to try and make something that's very simple to set up and use with kind of the least amount of work or Drupal knowledge possible. So really wanted to try and make it something that could be kind of work automatically out of the box. And so it uses a automatically created date-based summary. And then it has sort of a configuration in terms of setting what that string format is going to look like. And then it also displays those as tabs. So all of these are kind of like capabilities that were really created in some ways to try and make the event platform as simple as possible, but are now things that you can use more generally for other sites, either as part of the Smart Day module, or there's this views summary tabs module now that if that's a thing that you want, whether or not it's date-based, you can go ahead and use. The ability to have views granularity for dates. So the ability to say, show me all of the events that are on this specific day or the specific month or even the specific year, as opposed to having to sort of like manually set a start and end range. And then the ability to set minimum and maximum date values for a field, and potentially even pass in tokens. And we'll get to why that's useful in a second here. So for the sake of the demo that we're going to see, I created this fresh Drupal 9 install. So just a standard installation of Drupal 9.4, and then did this composer require on Drupal event platform, and then did this drush install of event platform Olivero, which actually installs a whole bunch of other modules, because it installs the rest of the modules in the event platform, as well as a handful of other kind of dependencies and modules that it uses under the hood. So for the sake of this demo, I called this a Yule Drupal camp. Did some basic configurations. So it uses config pages as a way to have kind of a single place where organizers can go to provide a lot of the configuration for the setup. And then it actually uses tokens as a way to basically take some of the information, in this case, specifically the start and end dates that are provided within here, to set those as the start and end dates for when the sessions can be scheduled. So that's maybe a good point to actually go in here and sort of show exactly what we're talking about. So if you're not familiar with the config pages module, it's actually a pretty powerful module for managing what I would call like, it's like one-off fieldable entities. So it can be a great way to provide configuration options for a website and then use those in a variety of different ways because it has good, token support and some other things. So specifically for the event platform, there's the spot. We put it directly within the main navigation, sort of the admin navigation. And so as an event organizer, you can go directly in there and put in all of the information for your event. So the event name, what year it is, where it is, the start and end dates for the camp. You could put in submission deadline, and then it has some fields for, header CTA, so the URL and the link text, description text, and then also a link that's going to appear within the media. So we go in here and let's go back to the website. If we go to the home page, we can see where it's populating all of those fields. So here's where it puts the header CTA. Here's where it puts the description and the location and dates, and that link that it puts there as well. It also is going to take some of that information and it's going to put them into, as an example, this copyright block at the bottom. It's going to use some of that information to automatically populate into like notifications. So it's got a system set up when your users submit session proposals and you go in and moderate those, and you can say, this one is accepted, this one was not accepted, so it's rejected. It's going to automatically send those out, and it's basically got placeholders where it's going to take the camp name from that other page. And so by default, it's going to create messages that are specific to your camp without you having to kind of write those. You still have the option if you wanted to go in and sort of do those as more custom email messages. But again, the spirit of this was as much as possible to make it like, as a camp organizer, I go into that one place, I put in my camp information, and then a lot of this other stuff, as much as we can, kind of just works out of the box. So let's see here. Let's go back to our config page, and just to show here. So right now we've got this running December 21st to 23rd. So let's just change this to, let's say, the 20th to the 23rd and save that. And so one of the things that was interesting about the Florida Drupal Camp site in terms of how it was architected was the, rather than assigning the sessions times directly, it has this idea of using taxonomy terms as the time slots, and then essentially assigning sessions to those time slots. So let's look at the time slot interface here and what that looks like. So it's very simple. Basically, you just have to assign the time and it does the rest. We talked before about the minimum and the maximum dates. And again, it based on the values that are populated into that config page, it actually passes those through automatically into this form in terms of setting minimum and maximum dates. You don't have to worry about somebody who maybe is, not familiar with the specifics of the camp going in and potentially creating slots that are like outside the range of when the camp is on. It automatically restricts it, so you can only use dates that are actually within the range that's configured there. So in this case, we could go in and say, on the 20th, we want to have a session slot for 10 a.m. In this case, it defaults to 45 minutes. You can configure if you want, a different default duration for those. You could say, maybe you only want to have 30-minute sessions. And so that's definitely something that is fairly straightforward to configure. But the idea being, with a couple of clicks here, we've created a new time slot. And that's.
Can I interject for a second? So
yeah, for sure.
One of the reasons behind us using taxonomy terms for our time slots was because I am on the Pacific coast, and when I entered them, it would localize. So to make it easier on me as a content author, we decided to put them as taxonomy because then it wouldn't localize to my time zone. Because for a while we couldn't figure out why sessions were all wonky all over the place. So that's sort of where that came about.
Oh, okay, that's great. I mean, I think it's a good solution anyway. It had never occurred to me to do it that way. And then when I saw that, I was like, oh, it makes perfect sense, especially if you have a camp that potentially has multiple rooms, because it has, again, a different taxonomy for rooms. So when you have a session, then as the administrator who's going in, you accept a session, you assign it a time slot and a room, and then it's basically ready to go. There is a module, I think it's called Allow Only One, that allows you to set up some constraints in terms of so you could do something like build that into a site to say only allow one session to be at the same time slot and room, as an example, right? So I think using something like that with this could also provide a good solution in terms of making sure that you don't accidentally have the same or two different sessions assigned to the same room and time slot, as an example. So anyway, I thought that was a good solution, and it makes perfect sense what you're saying. I've definitely heard of people who have those kinds of challenges around time zones. So having one person just set up all the time slots, and then as they get accepted, assigning them the time slots, I think is probably faster anyway. So any questions on some of the stuff as we go through? I mean, this part in particular is really meant to be sort of this is stuff that I just thought was interesting and worth sharing. There's a couple of blog posts about this, but I thought it would be kind of interesting to do a bit of a walkthrough. And if people have questions or want to well, how would I do X instead of Y, or any of those kinds of things, then definitely be happy to have those discussions as we move through. All right, I'm going to switch here to a different user. So this is somebody logged in as sort of a, the speaker profile, which for people who register on the site, they get automatically assigned to this speaker role. And so when they go in to create a session, we can see that there are kind of, well, I guess we will see that there's sort of a restricted set of fields that they have access to. So they can set the title and description. They can specify what they see as the audience and session category. So those are available to populate, put themselves as the speaker, and essentially from a workflow standpoint, they only have the option for this to be saved as proposed. And then when we go ahead and save this, we can see that now it's accepted that as a proposed session. We could go into our sessions list and see that. I think this was the one that we just created here. Now, as an administrator, if I go in to that same session list, and let's say we go in to, another thing that I thought was an interesting suggestion, and this was Mike Herschel of the Florida Drupal Camp that suggested this session list is actually ordered by a random sort instead of being alphabetical or by date or something. So interesting thing there is that, the same user can go to the session list multiple times and sort of see different ones on top and so on. So potentially be exposed to more content that way, which I thought was an interesting approach. Let's just go in and edit one of these, basically to show that as an administrator, when I go in, there are a variety of additional fields. So you can have sessions that are really intended to be training or non-sessions. So the idea being exclude those from your session list. There are also things around social media cards. So there's built-in capabilities around helping these things to be promoted across social platforms. As an administrator now, I have the ability to sort of accept or reject. And if I was to choose one of those and then save it, it's going to kick off again the workflow notifications that's going to email out to the person who proposed that session to say, congratulations, it was accepted, or, you know, sorry, it was rejected, but, you know, thanks for taking the time to submit your session. And here's where you can now assign this to a time slot. So in this case, let's just throw that onto December the 21st. We'll assign it to a room. Let's go back to our session and get a couple more of these scheduled. So let's set this one here, there, and let's see what else we've got here. That's good. This is another one we haven't scheduled. So you can see that, you know, the process of going through these and, you know, processing them in terms of whether they're accepted or rejected, assigning the time slot, you know, the way this is set up becomes very, very simple and quick to do in terms of being able to manage these. And now if we go into our schedule now, we should see that we've got let's see here. So it's automatically creating these tabs for us, you know, based on when things are scheduled. I think there's maybe, I think because we don't have anything scheduled on the 20th, there's something here that may be a bit off that needs some tweaking. So the event platform officially is in beta. There's definitely sort of ongoing work in terms of making it better. There were like some of the capabilities that we're looking at tonight were like literally implemented this week and will probably be released in like a version of, you know, Smart Date and a new update of the event platform, like probably over the weekend. And so, you know, if there are ways where, you know, you want to use this and you think it could be better, then by all means open an issue, because, you know, it is sort of in very active development. And so if there are ways that this could be, you know, changed, tweaked to better suit a use case that, you know, is definitely a way that you want to use it, then this is a great time to sort of share those thoughts and potentially have it, you know, built to address those valid use cases. So, but yeah, so you can see where it's automatically generating these summary tabs, formatting those as tabs, whereas the default for Drupal is to either show those as more of just like a, you know, unordered list or as just plain links. And to be able to sort of group these by day as well. So any sort of, you know, questions around any of the date capabilities, the event platform, kind of any of these things that we've been seeing here? Seeing some comments in the chat here. Let's see here. Take organized distribution. Where's comments? User control option. Hybrid conference, 3 time zone. Zones in the time zone selection. So that's definitely a thing you could do. Just trying to think from a display standpoint. Let's look at the view configuration. So these are really using like PHP format strings, so you could definitely include a timestamp in there. Let's see here. Let's go session. Session list. Session schedule. Go. Just on the term when. And in this case, we're using time only. So if we wanted to, what we could do is go into our Smart Date format, update our time only. So let's see here. never remember these off the top of my head because I don't use them quite often enough. So year time. So times, here we go. Time zone. So depending on if we wanted, let's say, to use E here, go back in here and say, oh, we can use that. Okay. On the hour, just to and let's go ahead and save that. Go back to schedule. That. So now it's got the time zone information explicitly put into there. So hopefully that gives you a sense of, it's fairly easy to go in and tweak sort of the display of these in terms of, if you want it to have time zones in there, some of those kinds of things.
I don't know what the Drupal equivalent is, but in our backdrop events, we've been using a module called user time zone tokens, where you can put a token in there and it uses the browser time and actually converts it to whatever the user's local time zone is. And that has been working pretty good. And there must, I would think there's a Drupal equivalent of that module.
So there is this option for site time display. I think in this case, because we didn't explicitly set time zones, it's not doing a lot of conversion. And also because the user and the event are sort of both site default. But so let me go back to, let's see here, the session, go back to one event. Slots, which form display. So if for whatever reason, probably it's not necessarily going to be as useful for, this kind of a like camp idea, but if you wanted to be able to manually set the time zone in there, then you can save that. And then when we go to create one, now we have the ability to explicitly set a time zone. So we could say, Chicago as an example as the time zone, and then it could start to do some things where, if an event is set in Chicago time, but as a user, I've set my profile to be New York time, then it'll basically show when I'm logged in as that user and I've set my profile to be New York time, it'll show the event in the Chicago time zone, but then in brackets, it'll basically show it in New York time so that I can sort of see both, that like locally it's this, but in my time zone, it's that. Let's see here. Okay, actually I've seen this. Manually transcribe time zone, it's cumbersome, confusing, and sort of struggle during events. So yeah, I mean, personally, I found that this time zone control works pretty well. The other thing you can do, so notice that it has basically, every PHP time zone. You could also do things like in the form here, we could say, maybe we don't need every time zone available. We just want to have, let's say, New York. Let's go Chicago and Los Angeles as a very simple example. And then when we go back to our form here, you can make that nice and easy for your users if you don't need to, support every time zone under the sun kind of a thing. Yeah, lots of interesting discussion around backdrop. Excuse me. Both of the modules use the browser time zone to convert for unauthenticated users. Okay, interesting. Worried about how accurate they would be at the start, but find them pretty reliable for small events where I've used them. Great. Any other sort of questions or comments around some of the stuff that we've seen here? Also, I mean, it looks like there's some good discussion going on in the chat here. If people want to just like unmute themselves and have this discussion, like I can stop the share and we can just basically turn this into more of a discussion for the rest of the time that we have, if that works for better for folks.
Well, I can just say out loud what I was sharing with Bob, which is that we've got two modules now, both of which tap into the browser, sort of the session data or whatever, for what the browser's time is. So they convert time zones or times on the fly to the user's time zone and with unauthenticated users. You don't have to be logged in. And as I said in the chat, we were at first worried about the accuracy of these, but for events with people in pretty distributed parts of the world, so far we haven't had any problems. Somebody in our planning crew had used one of these on an event, an academic event, where a lot of people were using browsers that apparently just weren't synced right, and they were getting bad information. So we were really worried about that happening, but it didn't. So far, we haven't had any problems. And I bring this up, I assume there would be some Drupal versions of those modules, but I think both of these were written directly for Backdrop, unlike a lot of modules which have been converted from Drupal. But I would assume that somebody has done something like this for Drupal.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem. And, if you can trust your browser session, then you're great. But if you can't trust that, or you can't trust that they're going to be authenticated, or have some kind of a hierarchy in there that selects what that user wants to do, or gives them a warning. For instance, if I say, show me in my times in my local time zone, show me the time there, then then you'd have to have some way to flag them that it's not working properly for them, if you're really going to do it right.
Well, what we do is we display it in their local time zone, but include the time zone, right? So that they can see what we're displaying, and then hopefully they'll realize if they're getting the wrong time zone, hopefully they'll notice that. But so far, we haven't had anybody report that their browser is reporting the wrong time zone. In our case, again, somebody anecdotally told us that in a different event, they had that problem. But
sure. I've been on a lot of sites where you don't even have the option, and I've been trying to figure out how the best way to go to deal with that is, and it's not an easy scenario. So it really isn't.
Yeah, I think that approach of making sure that you specify the time zone is definitely a good call out when you think that there's the potential for people in different time zones to be accessing it, or potentially, just really any level of confusion. Being really explicit about which time zone something is being displayed in, even if, as you say, you potentially get it wrong in terms of which one you're showing them, and at least they'll have the context to be able to kind of go, okay, well, that's Mountain Time. I'm not Mountain Time, but at least I know that's like 10 a.m. Mountain. So if I'm Central, then I can do the conversion myself, kind of thing.
Yep.
So yeah.
I know I'll check. I'll be like, oh, when is my session at Colorado camp? And I'll look and be like, oh, 2 p.m. But I'm in California the day before, and then I get there and I'm like, oh no, it's not 2 p.m. So yeah, I've done that several times.
I'm not where I normally are.
Yeah,
oh no.
Got
I'm
a
all
related
messed up.
use case to try to relate it to office hours, where it's not not an event, but different locations with open and closing hours, but potentially in different time zones. And the user could be in a different time zone altogether from where the location is.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, very cool stuff though, Martin. Awesome.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean,
And
I'll
if-
definitely have a look at those backdrop modules because, as you say, it sounds like those were developed specifically for backdrop, but I'm sure there's like front end code that potentially could be ported the other direction. So
Exactly. I would think it would be pretty easy to port them.
yeah.
I know from a content entry point of view, even though Florida Camp had its bugs last year, it was extremely just straightforward and easy to use compared to the COD distribution that we were using the previous years, where we had to do something every year that was funky and do a workaround. But yeah, the Florida Drupal campsite, like if someone didn't have any Drupal experience, they could go in there and they could do most everything without having to ask any questions. It was really nice.
It's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I feel like so the approach that the event platform has taken so far is really basically taking the configuration and bundling that into these, sets of modules so that, a site can either use them all together or potentially like be more selective in terms of which ones that they want to use. The sort of parallel conversation that's going on right now is around sort of like recipes and starter kits in the Drupal community. And so it's possible that at some point we'll want to, wouldn't want to say like throw out what we've been doing, but like there could be a version 2 that uses this like new approach that the community is working on around like recipes or what have you. And so it'll be interesting to see like, how different those things are in terms of the approach that's already been taken. But really wanted to sort of, take some of the great work, as you say, that's been done on the Florida Drupal Camp website, share that more broadly and just start to collect feedback in terms of, how people think potentially it could be better.
Martin, have you plugged into the distributions and recipes thing at all? Have you looked at that and kind of tested anything out?
So I haven't really had a chance to play around with anything yet. I mean, I was part of some of the early discussions and I just kind of got like buried in a bunch of other things. And so, life happens and you, try and contribute to the conversations where you can and where you feel like you can contribute. But definitely hoping I can sort of get back up to speed at DrupalCon Europe and get a better sense of, the current lay of the land and what the road ahead looks like for those. So
very cool. Very cool. It's exciting stuff.
Yeah, I think I'm really excited about the starter kits and recipes because I feel like it's really going to make Drupal a good solution again for like non-enterprise organizations to be able to do some really interesting and compelling things without having to spend a big chunk of money to hire professional Drupal developers. I think the project browser is really going to be, I think, powerful too. Automatic updates, another one, and I think CK Editor 5, which this week is now officially stable for Drupal 10, is potentially going to open up some pretty interesting capabilities as well around like potentially using like real-time collaboration and some other cool things. So.
And the starter kits, UCSF used starter kits for Drupal 7 all the time, and it was really convenient for each different school. You didn't have to be a Drupal developer. Here's your starter kit. Here's some information you plug in. And so it really helped them with lowering the cost of their web services because they could maintain it and do it themselves. It was a multi-site, so someone still had control over the code base. But these starter kits, you could almost theme and stuff. I'm a big proponent of those over distributions. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Much easier to deal with small pieces than the whole distribution.
Mm-hmm.
I never, the only thing I ever used distributions for was, a model to kind of figure out what type of thing I wanted to put together,
Oh, you never used Panoply?
Oh, I didn't say I never used it. I said the only thing I ever proposed it for. I've been taking care of a couple orphans. Yeah. So.
I am going to stop recording